I've been a kind of critic, if you like, of that growth-based model. And I started being a critic of it when I was an advisor to the UK government it was back in Tony Blair's government, and then Gordon Brown's government. And I was critical of this position that they took way back then. I mean, growth. Keir Starmer kind of tells us that's his special new mantra. But actually it's not. I mean, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng talked about it in their disastrous 3-week-old government, or what it was.
What I will say is,
I believe we need to grow the size of the pie.
Growth is the #1 priority of this government.
Growth requires hard choices.
We need a proper plan to properly boost growth.
So the pie is bigger.
The growth corridor.
growth is really important to our agenda.
So that everyone gets a bigger slice.
Unlock further growth.
We need to grow the pie.
Growth was the Labour Party's mission in opposition. It is now our national mission.
So we are here with Tim Jackson, who is an economist and writer who has spent the last 30 years researching and writing about sustainable growth, capitalism, well-being, and is also an award-winning playwright. Is that right?
Yes, yes, indeed.
Throw that in. We're at
the
we're at the People's Museum of Somerstown. Tim, thank you for talking to us.
It's a pleasure, Daisy. Good to be here.
Good to see you.
It's an amazing venue, which everyone must come and visit.
Shout out to the People's Museum. So, for starters, I think since Keir Starmer came into government, his big buzzword has been growth, growth, growth.
Right.
But it's not always clear, in my opinion, what growth actually means and who it's for, and why is it such a priority for our leadership?
Well, can I be honest? I'm not sure it's clear to Starmer either. Okay. What it's supposed to mean, and this is the way the economy is supposed to work, in fact how society is supposed to work, is that it gets bigger and bigger. That's why it's called growth, growth, growth. And that means that there's more wealth in society, there's more income, and that means we're all better off and we have better lives, and the world is a better place. It's a kind of big shiny promise that politicians in particular really like to make, that they will deliver a better society. And so what they're talking about specifically when they say growth, 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 is growth in something called the GDP, which is a measure. It's really just a measure of the busyness of the economy, how much is being produced, how much is being sold, how much is being bought, how much we're consuming. And it's supposed to be an indicator of how well off we are, but there's a couple of problems with it. One is that it depends who gets all of that growth, it depends who gets that wealth, and we're living in a more unequal society, so that a lot of people are getting richer and richer, and actually conditions for many people, many ordinary working people, are getting worse. Their wages are actually falling in real terms, even as we grow this economy. And the other problem, of course, is that as you grow, you're producing and consuming much more stuff, and that's having a big impact on the planet, and the room for the rest of humanity, and indeed the other species we share the planet with, is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So grow means lots more for some people, and actually a lot of damage to the planet, and sometimes not even a decent wage for people who are doing really important jobs in society. And that's kind of where we are.
And a lot of your work has focused on post-growth. Could you tell us in simple terms what post-growth is, and how it's different than degrowth? Yeah. I mean, in a way, my work is, I've written about degrowth, I've written about post-growth, I've used lots of different languages, I've talked about prosperity without growth, the idea that, yes, prosperity matters. Prosperity means doing well, it means living well. But it isn't the same thing necessarily as having lots of income and lots of growth. And so I've been a kind of critic, if you like, of that growth-based model. And I started being a critic of it when I was an advisor to the UK government back in Tony Blair's government,
and then Gordon Brown's government. And I was critical of this position that they took way back then. I mean, growth. Keir Starmer kind of tells us that's his special new mantra. But actually it's not. I mean, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng talked about it in their disastrous 3-week-old government, or what it was. And almost every other politician has also trumpeted that idea. So it was never popular to criticise it. But it's become much more relevant to criticise it, partly because of the damage we're doing to the planet, partly because, as I said, lots of people aren't benefiting from that growth. And partly, and this is the trickiest thing in a way, because actually when you look at it, growth has been harder and harder to achieve. The kind of growth that Keir Starmer's talking about when he says growth, it just hasn't been the same. And it's not that it hasn't been the same since the pandemic, or it hasn't been the same since the financial crisis. It's actually been disappearing slowly for the last half a century or so. So we've had less and less growth, and we're still chasing after it. And that's dangerous, because when you chase after something that isn't there, you begin to neglect the things that really matter, like people's health, like their livelihoods, like the solidarity that exists in community, like the integrity of the neighbourhood, and even just basic living conditions get thrown away because they don't contribute. Looking after those things doesn't contribute to growth. So we're busy chasing this dream of growth, while people are increasingly living, in poor welfare conditions, in poor housing, without adequate means of providing a living for themselves, with poorer educations, with education that actually isn't meeting our needs anymore, and with a health system that's falling apart because we're chasing the bling and not focusing on what matters.
Who is, not just politicians, but who is pushing this myth that growth is better for everyone? Where does it come from?
Well, obviously there are people who benefit from it. You know, the growth has mostly benefited the rich over the last 30 years in particular. So even while real incomes have stagnated for many ordinary working people, in particular the people who really matter to us, like those who work in the health sector, the incomes of the richest have increased, and their wealth has increased as well. And there's been a kind of accumulation of wealth in property, in particular, in financial assets, and that accumulation is drawing more and more income towards the rich and keeping more and more income away from the poor. So there is a sense in which the growth model is benefiting some people. There's also a sense in which, and we shouldn't underestimate this, there is a sense in which if we had the growth, and if it were equally distributed, that would mean that the government in principle might have more tax returns and therefore could spend more on welfare. But actually that doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen for a couple of reasons. One is that the growth is being accumulated by the rich. And the other is that the government has priorities, for example, like driving us into almost impossible military conflicts in places which are going to destabilize geopolitics for a long time to come, and spending money on arms to do that, instead of spending that money which they might have had from growth on building, let's say, a better health service. So that's two of the reasons. And the third one, which is I've sort of alluded to, is that growth kind of isn't there anymore. And so although what there is of it is going to the rich, it's leaving very little behind for that model of the welfare state to spend on the people who really need it. And those are circumstances in which, yes, there are still people calling for growth. Yes, there's still a kind of a rationale. We're still sort of growth dependent because the government's tax coffers depend on having some, us being able to earn some wages on which we pay taxes, which then goes to the government, which they then pay, hopefully, for the things that we need. But it isn't happening, it isn't working in the way that it's supposed to work, and it's becoming less and less possible to see how it could work because the growth just isn't happening. And that's the sense in which my argument is that we should be thinking about a post-growth world. To some extent, we're already living in a post-growth world because that underlying growth just isn't there anymore, and what there is of it is going in the wrong place. And so we have to figure out a different way of running the economy for those different circumstances, because they are not anything like what Starmer means when he says growth, growth, growth. It just isn't happening.
When you wrote your first book in 2009, it was a government report, right, as you said. And I've heard you say before that when the Prime Minister heard about it, he went ballistic, was the kind of language used.
I think I avoided actually saying that it was the Prime Minister. I think I said number 10 went ballistic.
Number 10 went ballistic, not the Prime Minister.
Yeah. Well, he did interesting. It was very interesting when the report was launched. The day it was launched, I was supposed to be on the Today programme talking about it, and they bumped me for a news item in the Prime Minister's constituency in Scotland. And I can't even remember what the news item was about now, everyone's forgotten it, but it was enough to sort of bump me on the Today programme. So it is fair enough to say, yes, the Prime Minister didn't like it. Yeah. It's still not something that you can easily get politicians to think about. And we have tried, actually. My research centre is the Secretariat for an all-party parliamentary group on the limits to growth. And we've done that for nearly 10 years, nine and a half years, I think we've been plugging away at that. And it's been really, really interesting because what we've done is we've created a small cohort of very committed parliamentarians, some really good people who understand what the issues are. But it's never gone out beyond that into a kind of, it's not what Starmer is announcing or what Kwasi Kwarteng was announcing.
What do you think it would take to get to that point? I mean, is it total climate breakdown?
Well, yeah, possibly climate breakdown, but in a way, I think before they react to climate breakdown, they're probably going to whack to economic breakdown, and that's kind of coming down the line when you're trying to drive your model along a railway track that you just keep repeating the mantra and keep going along, chugging down the track, expecting things to change, and they're not actually changing. And that's sooner or later, that's a train crash waiting to happen. That's something that we can't go on doing. If everything looks like it's going to be fine, then it's a hard message to put across. And the difficulty is when everything is not fine, then they're busy, chasing growth even harder. And what we need actually is a sort of Chancellor of the Exchequer who would tell the truth, that the Emperor has no clothes, that the God of growth is no longer listening to our prayers, and therefore we should be designing the economy in a different way. And there's plenty of really important ways to start thinking about how you do that. But first of all, you have to get the politicians, and in particular the government and those in particular in the Treasury, I would say, to take that idea seriously.
Your new book is called The Caring Economy.
The Care
Economy, yeah. Excuse me.
Yeah.
What is the care economy, and how could we reframe society to be more caring? I wouldn't quite ask the question that way. The care economy for me is not a sort of subsector of the economy. It's not the idea of saying, we should be nice to each other. It's not a way of sort of taking the moral high ground. And that's one of the problems with the word care, is it tends to be sort of conveyed as an almost unassailable moral good, something which is obviously good. It's good if you care for people, and it's good if you show you care for people, and it's good if you're seen to be showing that you care for people, no matter what you're doing, almost, as long as you can cast it as care, then it's unassailably good. And that's problematic because it stops us being able to say what care actually is, what it means to care. The starting point for that, for me, goes right back to prosperity without growth. And when we asked what people meant when they talked about prosperity, they said, well, primarily health. That was the thing that came quite often top of the list. Now, health is really interesting. Health in the human body is really about balance. It's always about balance. It's about not having too much, and it's about not having too little. And the body itself has a mechanism called homeostasis, which regulates everything constantly in the body to make sure that it's in balance, to try and make sure it's in balance. Our heart rate, our breathing, our blood pressure, our blood glucose, our dopamine levels are all under this process of regulation. Balance, balance, balance. Not too much, not too little. And that idea is incredibly interesting when you put it against the idea of growth, because what is growth about? It's about having more and more and more and more and more. So you've got a mechanism that's all about having more and more and more, increasing the whole time, driving towards more, when actually health, real prosperity, is about balance. What happens when you've got a mechanism that's driving towards more, when you're trying to keep things in balance,
whoa, they go out of balance. You don't even notice the point at which they go out of balance, and even if you did, you couldn't stop because you're driving towards growth. So this is it turns on its head what we mean when we talk about prosperity, and it says actually prosperity is more about health than it is about wealth, and as a result the economy should be more about care than about growth. What is care in that situation? It's attention to the point of balance. It's bringing us back into balance. So you can still talk about having more when people don't have enough, but you should definitely be talking about people having less when they have too much.
We went yesterday to do a video on the Patriotic Millionaires,
Right.
a kind of group of millionaires who are kind of begging the government to ask them to pay more tax, make them pay more tax.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're talking a bit about like individual level, how you can step outside of that matrix maybe. But then at the same time, there are people with a huge accumulation of wealth or power who, some of them also might want to step outside of the systems that are keeping others down. I mean, could there be a sort of pincer movement, do you think, that could make changes to...
I always think it's possible to envisage change. I think, change happens. It's almost the one constant is that change happens. So we know change happens. And so could that be changed for the better? Yes, of course it could. And is that a pincer movement between the very rich and the very poor? Possibly. I really have a great deal of respect for those guys because they're basically saying, I'm prepared to give up some of my resources in order to live in a better society. And ultimately, that's one of the messages about prosperity. It's very difficult to think about prosperity in individual terms. It's very difficult to think, well, I'm fine, thank you very much, but my kids are going to suffer for the next few decades of their life, or my neighbours are never going to, be able to afford decent housing, or, the environment is falling apart outside my wonderful garden, which is now living inside a gated community. That's not really prosperity. Prosperity is a kind of shared thing, and so thinking about, that movement of the Patriotic Millionaires to say I want to pay more taxes. I mean, to be honest, there's two tax rebellions that I know about. There's lots of tax rebellions, but the two, they sort of go against each other. And one is a tax rebellion that says, please let me pay more taxes, which is really interesting. But on the other hand, you want to know those taxes are being spent in the right place. And so the other tax rebellion, which is very famous, goes back to the American writer in the 19th century, refusing to pay taxes because he didn't want to be funding the war effort. And so actually there's a sense in which, just saying I'm going to pay more taxes is helpful to the government, but you don't know necessarily that the government has the right kind of agenda. You want the taxes to be in the right place. You want the concept to be the care economy, not the war economy. And that's as important as to think about as the simplicity of the fiscal mechanism. Tax is a kind of fiscal mechanism for transferring resources from the rich to the poor, and from the individual to society. And it's a really important mechanism, but you have to get it right, and you have to get the destination for those transfers right as well.
Do you think that then, you've said that change is a constant and there's always the possibility of change. Are you hopeful for a care economy, like a caring economy, a kind of better world where we're less obsessed with growth and limitless growth and more focused on health and prosperity societally?
Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the human soul and sings the song without the words and never stops at all. That's Emily Dickinson. And I kind of like that quote because what it says is that, however much we give up hope, hope never gives us up. Hope is a useful thing to have. But actually, being hopeful or being not hopeful is also a slight luxury. We should be struggling, we should be rebelling, we should be resisting, we should be taking the red pill, we should be lifting ourselves out of the matrix. And for that, hope may or may not be useful, but it isn't the essential commodity.